Good morning, everybody. Today is January 23rd, Tuesday morning. Welcome back to our ACT webinars. As always, my name is Stephen Bolden, your host. My company is 12-3 Marketing. We've been ACT consultants for about 14 years now. And today's topic is going to be on groups and group membership within ACT and why you'd want to use it and what it's good for. This is also a prerequisite to my next 3 follow-up webinars, which are going to be about ACT Emarketing. Every good email marketing blast needs a group of contacts to send to, and so it's good to have this as our first foundation here. So we all know that when we're looking at lists of contacts within ACT, I'm working out of the ACT demo database here with some sample data. We have 283 contacts, and this is all contacts within the database. And if we want to make a good group so that we don't have to look at all of them every single time, that is where you go to the group side. In the left-hand sidebar of ACT here, we can see groups, and we have some sample ones that should already be created for you, and you can make as many of your own as you'd like. So there's 2 types of groups. As I click on each one of these, you'll see that they are different subsets of contacts. They've each got their own a group name and a description here, and then a list of contacts below it. There's 2 types of groups. There's static groups, in which each of the members is manually added, and these do not change over time. They were kind of, you pick and choose every one of these contacts to add them to the group, and there they are. Static groups are very useful if you're just only dealing with a small subset, usually no more than a few dozen contacts at most, but there really is no true fixed limit. They could be very large. Static groups are where you pick an individual set of contacts, and then there's dynamic groups, where rather than choosing which contacts go into the group by the contact themselves, you choose which criteria define this group membership. For example, an ID status is equal to customer, and the state is in New York. That could be a sample of a dynamic group, and I'll show you a bit more about how we build that today. A dynamic group has the benefit that the members are always changing. Every time you click on a dynamic group, it will give you an exact snapshot of who fits that criteria at that moment, so that if contacts are added, deleted, or modified or changed over time that may meet or no longer meet the criteria, they'll be added and removed automatically. People use groups in ACT for all sorts of different things. I have seen hundreds of different applications for this. People have groups that will define salesperson's territories. They'll have groups for holiday mailing cards. All of you folks joining my webinar right now are in a webinar group in my own personal database. People use groups for determining contacts that are missing certain information. We have a question in the chat from Stephen. Could you check one of your sample contacts without an address to see if part of the dynamic criteria gets inserted into another field? For example, zip codes being duplicated in the address field. I will come back to that at the end. I see exactly what you're asking, I believe. I do want to keep moving forward on this question. He's asking if about seeing certain information, I think, in the group criteria maybe is being copied over to another field, and that might be something more in your defined field settings. It might not be groups at all. So let's build some sample groups and show how we'll do it. So in the group section of ACT, we can use the new group button right up here. Every group needs to have a name. So we start off with any group name that you desire. I'm going to call this one sample group, and I'm just going to put today's date in there. The description is optional, but it's usually good to have so that other users in your database, when they look back at these groups and wonder what somebody was doing, or when you find your own groups 4 years later and you can't remember what it was for, it's good to give yourself a description as well. So after you've got your information in there, I go ahead and press the save button. It's this little floppy disk icon on the blue toolbar here. There is an auto save feature in ACT. If I had clicked away to a different group, it would have actually saved that for me as well. I personally have made kind of a compulsive habit of using this little blue floppy disk save icon frequently. So we've now got ourselves an empty group. It says a count down here on this bottom toolbar of contacts are 0. Let's add some contacts to it. Right here on the group, the first tab here says contacts, and right below it is a button that says add/remove contacts. We'll go ahead and click that, and we have 2 panels that appear on this window. There's a very fine gray line that separates these 2 panels. We've got static members, which describes you can manually add or remove group members, and that's what we'll do for this first one. And then in the second area is dynamic members, where instead you can define criteria for the group. And you can actually have kind of a third type of group that blends these two, and maybe we'll come to that. So we've got static members. So let's just go click on this contacts button if we want to add some contacts to this group. And voila, I've got a list of all the contacts in my database. There's only 3 columns here: name, company, and email. I can sort them by clicking on the column headers. So if you'd prefer to find them based on their company name alphabetically, or based on an email address, or on their contact name, you can do so. You can also type in this search bar, and it will start searching for the contact by their name. Keep in mind that because it has them sorted by last name, comma, first name, that it's best in this look for box if you start typing by last name first. So if I want to find myself, I know that I'm in the database. I don't know the names of any of the other contacts because they're all junk contacts. But if we just pick and choose, we'll pretend our static group, we want these people, and you can go ahead and highlight them. On the left side is all the contacts in the database. Click on one, use the single arrow to move it over to the right side, which is adding it to the group. The double arrows will move all contacts at once. So double arrow to the right will move all, and double arrow to the left will empty all. Likewise, I can use a single arrow if I misclicked on somebody to pull them back out again. So go ahead and press OK. Our names have been added to this list, and I'll press OK again. Voila, we've got a static group. My count down here on the bottom says that there are 8 contacts in this group. And another nifty thing about these is that a group, for these tabs, they're very similar to the tabs that you would see on a contact record. We've got activities, opportunities, history, and notes. But when we're in a group view, we're instead going to see the history tab is actually a consolidated viewing of all of the histories across these contacts added into one feed. And same thing with the notes. These are all of the notes across all of these contacts. Just happens that there are none. But they are shown there consolidated for viewing. Same thing with activities, all of these activities across these contacts. When you're looking at a group view, the column headers that we see here, contact, company, phone, extension, email, title, and create date, just like we can do with so many other views in ACT, there is an options pull down over here on the right. This says customize columns. So that if you want to see different fields here, maybe we want to see ID status is missing out of there. Just like in the group window, you find all fields on the left, highlight one, use the single arrow to move it over. And then I can even move up and down if I want to put this ID status right about there. So you can add in different fields that you'd like to see into this view as well. They are also sortable by clicking on any column headers. So easy enough, that's a static group. Now you can go ahead and assign this to some other employee and say like, hey, there's a group of leads that I want you to call or follow up on, and they can find them here within the sample group. If you ever want to turn one of these groups into an export into Excel, it's a little funny that there is no direct export to Excel function from this group's view. You don't have the Excel button up here. But what we can do is, oh, good question. Stephen asks if customizing the columns, the view for this group changes it for all groups or just this one. I believe it's all groups. So when you change the customized columns, you're seeing the columns on every group that you have viewed changed. If we want to turn this set of contacts maybe into Excel, or just to work with them in a lookup view, maybe to modify them or to change something, you can turn any group into a lookup in the contact view with this little magnifying glass icon. It blends right in up on top there, but it says create lookup from group. It's right here on this blue toolbar. It takes my 8 contacts, moves me to the contact section of ACT, and now I have a lookup view, and I can export this to Excel. I could also do some other fun operations. Maybe if I wanted to do one of these edit and replace field operations or swap and copies. I have other videos that cover those. Now I want to move on to the more advanced one. We want to talk about dynamic groups. And also at any given time, if I click on these contacts, if I look on a contact record, along these tabs at the bottom under groups and companies, we can see groups that they are a member of. But we're going to go back to groups, and we're going to make a new group, and we'll call this sample dynamic group, and today's webinar, dynamic group for e-marketing. So let's pretend that we're trying to make an e-marketing group for next week. So the same way as before, I'm going to go to add and remove contacts, but instead of doing static members this time, I'm going to do dynamic members, where members are dynamically added or removed based on the group's membership criteria. So here are the criteria for this group. It's telling me there currently is none, but I can edit it. And the group criteria window appears here. So what we kind of have is a builder. This line here is a series of 4 drop-downs where we select values for each one of these drop-downs and then add it to the list of criteria. I'll show you what I mean. So maybe the first drop-down, well, the very first one asks what type of contacts are being added to this group. We pretty much always want to leave this as contacts. You can have groups of opportunities as well, but for every purpose that I've usually seen, contacts is by and large the one that you want. So you have your type as contact, then your field name. These are all of the contact fields within your ACT database. There are many. I'm going to start with email because this is an email marketing group. So I want to, actually I'm going to do email second just because I have a reason. I'll show you in a moment. I'm going to start with ID status. So we'll have ID status. The operator is what type of, I don't want to use the word operator, what type of filter we want to apply to the ID status field. We can do contains, which would be contains some type of string of characters. So for example, if I wanted to do ID status contains customer, I can do that. But it is a little different. We have things like contains or equal to is different than contains. If I said ID status contains cust, I will get everybody who has the word, the letters CUST somewhere in their ID status, which in this case is getting me everybody who contains customer. That might fail me though, because if I had an ID status that was called custard, then they would appear in the list as well. So you have to think very logically when you're looking at some of these operators, because contains is different from equal to. Equal to means that it doesn't just contain those letters, it is exactly equal to it, nothing more, nothing less. We also have things like starts with and ends with, if we wanted it to just have those letters at the beginning or at the end, rather than anywhere within the middle. We have not equal to, greater than, less than, contains data, does not contain data. It's enough to almost make your head spin, but you just got to think that the system, from a computer logic standpoint, each of these logical operators does have very subtle differences between them. In this case, I am going to go with contains to say ID status contains, and now I have to put a value in the value field. In this case, I will say customer. This drop-down shows possible ID statuses that I have, or I can type something in there freely if I want. So I've built my criteria along the top bar, and I add it to the list. It's now written right there. I'm looking for contacts where the ID status contains customer. And if I show preview, then I have 83 contacts that meet this criteria. One of the reasons that I chose contains, for example, some of my contacts seem to have multiple ID statuses. It's a checkbox field that can be multi-select. So if I have a customer that meets multiple, like Liz here, who's a customer and an influencer, if I had changed this to, instead of being contains and directly equal to, it's going to essentially eliminate anybody who has extraneous info in there. It's going to find people who are exclusively customer only. Just an example of some of the subtle differences that we have here. And the buck does not stop here. We've only got one criteria in our list. We can add many. There is no limit as far as I know. You could have dozens or hundreds of criteria in here, although it generally doesn't go very much above a handful. So for the next field, if this is going to be an email marketing group, I want to make sure that they have email addresses. So I will choose the email field, as I was going to before. And just like the ID status, I have my operator where I could say contains or equal to, but all I'm looking for here is that they have something written. I just don't want any contacts where the email address is blank. So for that, we have an operator called contains data. If I choose contains data as my operator, the value field goes straight out. It's blank. I don't actually need to specify anything. I'm done. It says I'm looking for contacts where the email contains data. Add it to the list. Now it's going to narrow my count of 69 contacts down from just anybody who's a customer, and narrow it down, if I preview, to only people who are customer and have an email address. There's only 31 of them left, no blanks. You might notice there's a lot of duplicates in here. That's from a topic I did a couple weeks ago on duplicate removal in ACT. So I intentionally duplicated my database. But so we're getting there. We've narrowed down a group. At this point, we could be done. We're looking for ID status is equal to customer and the email contains data. I could say okay here and save this up, but I want to address the and or field, because I now have, when you have multiple, more than one criteria within here, you can start specifying if you want to have both of them be valid or one or the other. So this and or, if I click on it, is actually a drop down where I can change this from and over to or. Now I'm going to find contacts whose ID status is a customer or the email contains data. You read this along line by line, like a long logic operation. Now, rather than narrowing down to somebody that satisfies both criteria, I'm going to look for people who meet one or the other. So instead of 31 contacts, I would have 227. They are either a customer or they have an email or both, just not neither. At least for every one of these 227, one of those criteria is true. In this particular example that I'm showing you now here for an e-marketing group, we would want this set to and. But there are a lot of circumstances where I might want to do an or. For example, if I was saying state, I can do state equal to NY. Maybe I'm looking for customers who have emails that are in New York. This would be a big and. But what if for my email marketing group, I wanted to get only people that were in, like the New England kind of area, so that I would also want to add Vermont in there, and I'd want to add, I'll just say a couple of these here, and we'll have Massachusetts. I'm not going to add them all to save some time. Well, certainly I can't leave all these columns as ands, because it's impossible for somebody to meet all of these criteria. They can't have their state be New York and Vermont and Massachusetts all at the same time. So what I would want to do here is, for these last few lines, change them to ors. I'm basically looking for people that meet the first two criteria and one of these three. It can be any one. Bad example though, because it seems like I'm not meeting anyone, finding anybody that meets these. So that is an example of where you want to use ORs, and it raises one final piece of building these dynamic criteria that gets the last and most confusing part, is these two blank columns here that have the left and right parenthesis on them, open and close paren. Just like if you remember, mathematical operations have an order of operations, PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. You do everything that's within parentheses first is resolved, if you think about this like old school arithmetic. Using these drop downs, they have a whole lot of selections of opening and closing parentheses around certain types of your criteria. Even though each one of these criteria is shown on a separate line of 5 lines, in your head, you should visualize it as one very long line, as if all of them were on one line here, and it's kind of to save space. We've got ID status contains customer, and email contains data, and at this point, I might want to open a parenthesis on the left side after the and parenthesis. The state is equal to New York or Vermont or Massachusetts, and then close it out before the end. The reason being is that this logic could break down. It would be looking for anybody who satisfies one of 3 criteria. If I didn't have these parentheses, then somebody, let me see if I can do with like Colorado to show you as an example. I'm sure there's some Colorado context in this list. If I'm missing those parentheses, then Albert Berry slips into my group, even though he is missing an email address. And that's because from a strictly logical standpoint, the computer is thinking, he doesn't have, it could be ID status as customer and email and New York, or someone who's in Colorado just works as well. It doesn't matter if they meet any of the other ones because I'm missing that parentheses. If I add in these open and close parentheses, then that will get the kind of logic that I'm looking for. I know at this point, the parentheses kind of does confuse some people, but it is all just a big logical operator here that tells the computer in what order to process these dynamic criteria in for you. The good news is that once you're done, you just press the OK button and it's saved, it's done. You can even save the group afterward if you'd like with the floppy disk icon. But now this group's dynamic criteria are set. If I go back into that add and remove contacts, my dynamic members are set for now and into the future. I've got an ID status and my customer email, so that if I change anybody here by changing away their ID status or their email address, or maybe in the future I add an email address to a contact that was missing one now, they will automatically appear into my group. And this is important to know because next week when we start with eMarketing, when we go to send out the email marketing blast, it will ask which contacts do you want to send this to, and you can send it to a selected group. So it's handy to be able to build a really solid group before that. A good question from Will. It says, an old group that we don't use be deleted? Absolutely. At any time, you can delete a group by right-clicking on it and deleting the group. It will not delete the contacts within the group. So I can safely delete this sample group. It's not going to delete the contacts out of the database. It only removes the group itself. And those contacts are still safely within my database. So if you build one in error, or if there are a whole lot of old groups that you're not using, do feel free to right-click on them and out of this list and just simply delete them. You can also duplicate them. If there's one that has some similar criteria that you don't want to do the work of rebuilding and just modify some small pieces, you can duplicate a group. You can create a lookup. Groups can have their own access as well if you want to make them private or limited to just certain users within your database. Sometimes people do that with different territory groups. Yeah, I think that just about covers us for today. Steve Hunt, regarding your question about the, let me just read it once more. I'd have to look at exactly what's happening to your database regarding certain bad address info falling its way into a dynamic group. I do get a lot of emails from people that occasionally say that their dynamic groups are not behaving properly, but it is a system that's built strictly on logic. So there usually is not too much black voodoo going on that's like making the groups behave with the wrong kind of criteria and information here. It's normally a problem with which field name you might have chosen out of the drop down here, or which operators and ands and ors or parentheses you have selected. We'll take a look at those during our call, Stephen, personally. There are some interesting fields in here that are things like the any address field or the any phone field. So in ACT, you have different fields like a phone, a mobile phone, a fax phone, an alternative phone. And rather than looking up or having criteria for each one of them individually, like the phone field here, which is just only for their main phone line, they do have some of these any fields, which are very useful, where you can search for the any phone field to contain certain info. Possibly what's going on with, in your case, Stephen, is that maybe you've used the any address field rather than the standard address field, and it might be pulling information from duplicate areas. We'll have to address that differently. I'm going to open up the microphone now to any verbal questions. Oh, wait a minute. Susan has a good question. Do I have time to show us the criteria for upcoming birthdays? Absolutely. Good question, Susan. We have a group here. This is one of the sample ones made within ACT for upcoming birthdays. There's only one criteria here. So it says birth date is within the next number of days, and they wrote 30. That's a great question that you chose, because the examples I showed earlier, like the state and the ID status, are text fields. And so they have their own type of criteria for things like contains, starts with, or ends with. But dates fields that have date times in there have a different set of criteria. So we might have something like the create date. This is the date the contact was created. The operators here are different from the text-based ones. We still have contains data and does not contain data. But we also have things that are like after, next, within, last, older than. So if I wanted to say the create date is older than, and then it has days in brackets here, it's implying that whatever I type in the value is what's kind of being chosen for the days. So if I wanted to do something like create date is older than 30 days, now my group is for people whose birth date, the birth date field is within the next 30 days, and the create date is older than 30. I've still got one. Upcoming birthdays is a great way to do something like that. We've also got like recently added or recently edited contacts. This is like the contact edit date is within the last 30 days. So within the last, it's 30 days or less since the last time this contact was modified. People will use fields like this to have new leads that they want to see in a group that's always changing to show recently created contacts. It's a really great question. Susan wants to add an activity to remind you to send that card. Yes, you can do that. I would probably just set something up like on your calendar. There may be a way to kind of automate it within the group. They had a feature called Smart Tasks that never really worked very well that would supposedly be able to do something like that. If you wanted to have a birthday card group, I would probably say set something on your calendar for like the first of every month, or maybe like the first week of every month. You create an activity, call it send birthday cards to group, and then you'd want to like make this, sorry, get that contact off there. You'd want to make this like a recurring activity that maybe happens every month, and say, you know, remind me every month on the first Monday of the month, so that it is now on the, you have a task to remind you every single month to do it. It's not, then that task would just be on your calendar, and you'd have to remember to manually go into the group, look at the upcoming birthdays, and then write out your birthday cards for each month to kind of remember it that way. That would be my recommended course of action. Okay. Thank you everybody for attending today. Please join me next week for our next topic, beginning e-marketing. We'll sign up for our accounts and make sure that everybody's ready to rock and roll on that. Thank you and have a great week. Goodbye.